Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of Mr. Mackenzie's Distance Learning World War II, the Victory in Europe. Let's begin now. So, we're going to start today talking about the Grand Alliance. This was the Allied side. We'll get to the Grand Alliance in a second, but we're going to kind of recap what was happening in 1941. It was a very big, pivotal year. June of 1941, the Soviet Union is invaded by Germany. Operation Barbarossa begins. Even though many of Hitler's top generals advised him that this invasion was too early, he goes ahead with this plan anyways, commencing that three-pronged attack on the three major Russian cities there. And obviously, the sheer size of the Soviet Union made it hard to conquer. The bitter cold winter made it devastating to fight in, and it's not going to. They will have some initial success, but overall things won't go well for Germany in the Soviet Union. In December of 1941, right, December 7th, 1941, the United States is attacked by Japan, bringing the United States into this war. So by the time we get into January of 1942, we now have the creation of the Grand Alliance. With Great Britain, seen here in the photo, we have Great Britain with Winston Churchill. We have the United States with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the Soviet Union with Joseph Stalin. Now, as you're going to see, Churchill and Stalin will really not get along at all. The United States will always kind of be seen in the middle of these pictures. Roosevelt will be seen seating in the middle here as a buffer between Churchill and Stalin. So the United States and Britain do join war efforts. In the previous lecture, we talked about the Atlantic Charter and the Washington Conference. This is really when the United States and Britain coordinate war plans, and they kind of set things out of how this war is going to be fought, what is the strategy, where are they going to be going first, and whatnot. So they're definitely on the same page in World War II, which we did discuss, and how that's a big contrast from World War I, where every country seemed to be fighting on their own accord. But now they have a united front and a joint effort. Now, we talked about where they're going to go first the other day. Now, do we remember, where do they plan to attack first? The U.S. and the British. Where are they going? Well, if you remember, they are going to North Africa. Okay? North Africa. Now, why is North Africa a better option than Northern Europe? But maybe we'll take this time again to pause the video and see if you can write down a few answers on why it is a better option for the Allies to invade into North Africa rather than Northern Europe. Well, the Allies go ahead with the invasion of North Africa other than Northern Europe because really Churchill sees Italy as an easier adversary, and Italy was in North Africa. So it seemed like an easier route to get a foothold again into Europe and kind of come up on the underbelly of Europe, make your way into North Africa, then into Southern Europe through Sicily and Italy. It was a much easier route, they felt, than attacking Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Okay, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin do not see eye to eye. Stalin, what does Stalin want from the Allies? What is he really hoping for in this Grand Alliance? What is he going to get out of it? Ultimately, what Stalin really wants is for the Allies to open up a Western front, just like we saw in World War I. Create that two-front war havoc again for Germany. I mean, Germany's kind of in a two-front war now. I mean, they have a war with the Soviet Union in the east, and they do have the British in the west, but there's a whole kind of the English Channel separating them. In terms of people on the continent, there's not much in the West for Hitler to really worry about at this point. I mean, France has surrendered, and there's the puppet regime in Vichy France. So there's no real continental two-front war for Germany at this point. And that's what Stalin is really hoping for, that Churchill or the Allies open up a Western front. So the Allies go ahead with their strategy of going into North Africa first. Again, here's another question. Why didn't the Allies open up that Western front? Why not attack Hitler's fortress Europe? Ultimately, their goal is to get back into Europe, and that would be the quickest route there. But obviously, it's going to be the toughest route to get back into Europe. Northern France, along the coast there, Hitler's Atlantic Wall is very heavily fortified. The easier route was definitely through North Africa, then try to get up through Sicily and then into the boot of Italy. So Stalin is fairly upset with all this because he really thinks he's almost kind of being left on his own in the East without his friends or his allies in Britain and the United States opening up that second front in Europe. So he really feels like as long as the communists are fighting the Nazis and killing each other, the Western powers are happy to let that happen, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So as long as the communists and Nazis are killing each other, that's good for Churchill, I suppose. Okay, so after North Africa has been taken, the Allies will start what's known as the Italian campaign, and this really begins in July of 1943. Sicily is invaded. Italy will be taken a month later. The Italian people and the Italian government will eventually turn on Mussolini, and Mussolini kind of takes off, and he leaves. He is eventually kind of captured by his own people. He's ousted from power in July of 1943 and kind of takes off into hiding. Like I said, he's eventually captured by his own people, and things do not go well for Mussolini, okay, or even for Italy. In September of 1943, Italy will officially surrender from World War II. Let's look at this political cartoon. The tagline: "The new fascist salute." Here we see, obviously, Adolf Hitler screaming "Hail Hitler" to what he thinks are his allies in this war. We definitely see Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania still kind of giving the Hitler salute, but they're kind of nervous and scared about doing it. And, of course, now we have Italy, who has kind of turned their backs on Germany and have given unconditional surrender, and there's a bayonet pointing right at their chest. So Italy has officially surrendered from this war. But war does not stop in Italy. War does continue on in Italy, but it's the Allied troops fighting German troops in Italy. Okay, we do see the Canadians have a big role in the Italian campaign. We do see them kind of having these street battles. The Canadians had a lot of success in the Battle of Ortona, which you might have talked about in grade 10 history. We see this political cartoon again. We see the Allied nations kind of stomping up the boot of Italy, kind of poking holes in it with the bayonet from its rifle, as the Nazis are trying to wiggle their way out of the peninsula. They're trying to wiggle their way out of Italy as the as the Allied forces continue northward. So October of 1943, Italy officially joins the Allied powers. So they surrender to the Allied powers, and then they eventually declare war on Germany. So they kind of switch sides in 1943. So it's really at this point a true Western front can be opened in Europe again at this point. So it looks like the Allies now have a foothold in southern Europe. We saw them take North Africa. They now have taken most of Italy. Mussolini has been ousted from power. He's eventually going to be caught and killed. His body will be kind of put on display in in the town square. They kind of hang him with piano wire in this big kind of dramatic scene. So now Stalin will be happy because the Allies can really create that second front to kind of close in on Germany now. In November of 1943, we get the Turan Conference. Tehran is the capital of Iran. And here we get the big three of Stalin, FDR, and Churchill. You'll notice again FDR in the middle there, a nice buffer between Stalin and Churchill. And this is really the first time these three people actually meet together. It's here that the United States and Britain will, again, showing their kind of solidarity and their great coordination of war plans, that they appoint Dwight Eisenhower, who will later be president of the United States at one point, as Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. Operation Overlord, those D-Day landings will be designed under his helm. The D-Day landings happens on June 6, 1944. And this is really when the Allied forces really get that foothold back in Europe and kind of take down Hitler's fortress Europe and takes down that Atlantic Wall. The night before the D-Day landings, the Allies send in paratroopers. They also have a bombing raid in the French town of Calais. The Normandy invasions will be the largest amphibious invasion in human history. About 7,000 ships are involved, and at 6:30 a.m. the landings begin. Now the Germans didn't really expect an invasion at this point, and they weren't really focusing on Normandy as the location. They might have believed that it was happening further up the French coastline. So one of the big successful points of this invasion was the secrecy behind the operation, that no one knew the location or the time and date of when this was going to happen. So the Allied forces under the United States, this operation is really led by the United States. 5 beaches are involved. If you can look at the map there, you can see the northern France and the Normandy coast there. We have the United States have Utah and Omaha beaches. Omaha Beach, it was probably the most difficult and deadliest beach. If you ever saw the movie Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene takes place on Omaha Beach. The British have Gold and Sword, and the Canadians have Juno Beach. So the Allies were able to keep this location a secret. This is really a major factor to the success of these landings, that again the Germans weren't really expecting an invasion. Reinforcements weren't sent into the Normandy area. And it's this point that the Allies now have a foothold in Europe. They have come up from the south through Italy. Italy is out of the war and actually is on their side at this point. We have the Soviet Union pushing the Germans back from the east, and now we have the Allies back in Western Europe. And it's really at this point now that the Allies will enjoy air superiority in the war, which obviously to have that amphibious landing invasion, you are going to need that air superiority. And for the rest of the war, the United States or the Allies will really enjoy air superiority in Western Europe. Here is a newspaper article from the Montreal Daily Star. This was published in March of 1944. We did talk about the Canadians taking part in the D-Day landings. They had the beach, Juno Beach, but obviously the war didn't end on June 6. Okay, it continued after in Northern Europe. So just because the Normandy landings were successful doesn't mean the war was over. The war raged on in Europe for many months after that. If we look at the caption here, the Black Watch, it's spring and they're all set. There'll be no advance signal of invasion intentions when the British War Office decides the day has arrived for Anglo-Canadian forces to pound their way through the Nazi defenses of Fortress Europe. But when that day does come, men like these of Montreal's Black Watch will be ready for whatever their particular assault assignment may be. Men of the regiment, some of them with their faces blackened, commando fashion, are pictured taking time out during recent strenuous battle maneuvers in Britain, maneuvers in which the closest air-ground cooperation was thoroughly tested. Now, if you take a close look at the photograph, can any of you pick out my grandfather? Because he's there in the photo. Who do you think it is? That's him right there, my grandfather, Hector Leroy Mackenzie, who was in northern France just after the Normandy, just after D-Day. Wasn't there on the D-Day landings, but arrived shortly thereafter in northern France. So almost 1,000 Canadian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in northern France. One wounded Canadian was my grandfather, so he actually does get wounded. About a month after D-Day, he is wounded, and this is the letter that the Department of National Defense sent my great-grandmother, Mrs. Nellie Mackenzie, on the 5th of October, 1944. It reads, "Dear Mrs. Mackenzie, I am directed to inform you that additional official information has now been received from Canadian military headquarters overseas, advising that when your son, Lieutenant Hector Leroy Mackenzie, was wounded in action on the 9th of August, 1944, he sustained a shell fragment wound to the left side of the back, the left thigh and ear, with a traumatic rupture of the tympanic membrane, as well as a bomb fragment wound to the chest wall and popliteal space of the left femur. You may be assured that on receipt of any further information regarding your son's welfare, you will be immediately informed." A pretty grim letter to receive, but I'm sure it was a lot better than a letter that said killed in action. His fighting in World War II did not end there. He was kind of patched up and sent back into action, and continued in the military even after the war, and lived a very long life into his 90s, and saw great-grandchildren. So now the race to Berlin begins. It's really after those D-Day landings, those successful D-Day landings, that war changes tone. And we see a big shift in favor and momentum for the Allied forces. So the race to Berlin, we have our political cartoon. Who will get there first? Who's going to get to Berlin? The U.S.-British Second Front from the west, or Russia, symbolized by the bear, in the east, and it looks like I don't know, a tiny little bird in Italy. So at this point, things are not going well for Germany. North Africa has fallen. The Italian campaign by the Allied forces has been a success. Italy has surrendered to the Allies and even joined in the war on the Allied side, declaring war on Germany. The Allies get a foothold back in Europe with those successful D-Day landings, so they are coming in from the west. And now the Soviet Union is pushing back in the east, and they're pushing the Germans back out of the Soviet Union, back into Germany. So just like the political cartoon kind of illustrates here, it's really this race to Berlin. Who's going to get there first? The Allied US and British, or the Soviet Union and Russia? Now, the United States and the Soviet Union are really only friendly as long as there's Nazis around. Okay, kind of that old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We know the United States and the Soviet Union don't really get along. But they both have a common enemy with the Nazis. So as long as there's Nazis around, those two are good. Stalin never really fully trusts the West. He never fully trusts the British and the Americans, but he's willing to play along because they all have a common enemy. The United States is concerned that any territory that the Soviet Union takes as it moves further closer to Germany will be kept by the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union doesn't really sign that Atlantic Charter or that Washington Conference that we talked about in the previous lecture. So they're not coordinating their war plans like the British and Americans are. The British and Americans really laid out what this war is going to be about. It's not going to be for territorial gain. But the Soviet Union doesn't sign that. So they can fight this war for territorial gain. And as they push closer to Germany, any country that's they've gone through will now be shrouded behind what's going to be known as the Iron Curtain. So if you look on this map here, we can kind of see the communist takeover in Eastern Europe from 1945 to 1955. So as the Soviet Union really pushes back to Germany, all those nations will now find themselves behind what's known as the Iron Curtain. And we do see the emerge. We're going to see this is going to play a huge role in the Cold War that's going to be born out of the ashes of World War II. So the US and the British are pushing from the west. The Soviet Union is pushing from the east. Hitler is surrounded. Okay, things are getting closer and closer to Germany and to Berlin. And it's really Hitler at this point is going to kind of take things into his bunker. Many top Nazi officials, including Joseph Goebbels, his minister of propaganda, and his family, they're living in a bunker in Berlin. The political cartoon, the race for Berlin. Here we have this old German man kind of looking at the news bulletin. In the background, we see war-torn Germany is being destroyed. The Eastern Front by the Russian offenses and the Western Front with the Allied offensives. And he says, I hope the Americans get here first. So you really kind of see how the perceived idea was that Germany definitely doesn't want the Soviet Union to get to Berlin first. They'd probably much rather have the Western Allies get there first. So one of Hitler's last resorts is to really cut off the U.S. and British armies from their supplies as they're moving further to Germany and further away from the coast, from those landing operations. In a last-ditch effort, Hitler is going to order to kind of cut off supply lines to the U.S. and the British. So as the Americans are pushing further into Europe and getting closer into Germany, one of Hitler's last efforts is to cut off their supply lines from the coast. And this is Hitler kind of throwing everything he's got at the Americans here. So here we have the Battle of Ardennes Forest. This happens in December of 1944. The U.S. forces will be fighting everything the Germans have left. Uh, the line that the Americans are fighting on kind of bends and bulges, but it doesn't break. This battle, the Battle of Ardennes Forest, becomes known as the Battle of the Bulge, a major victory for the Americans. That the line, yes, it bended and bulged, but it never broke, and the Americans eventually do push through. Hitler's final offensive fails on the Western Front here, and now the U.S. have kind of a clear road to Berlin. So the results of this is Germany is done at this point. Their last resources are gone. But ultimately, what they did do is that they slowed the Allied advance down. They slowed down the Americans at Ardennes Forest enough to really guarantee that it's going to be the Soviets that get to Berlin first. So for that race to Berlin, it's the Soviets that get there first. The Americans, the Western Allies, are slowed down on the Western Front with the Battle of the Bulge. So April 25th, 1945, Russian forces encircle Berlin. Hitler can hear the bombings getting louder and louder and closer to his bunker. He knows his days are numbered. In his last bit of control that he has left, on April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. I guess he feels it would be kind of a better option to end it there than be captured and taken prisoner and be put on trial and be made a mockery. That is definitely something that Hitler does not want. So in his last bit of control, he takes his own life. His girlfriend, Eva Braun, also takes her own life. Many high-ranking Nazi officials take their own life, including Joseph Goebbels, his minister of propaganda. He takes his own life as well, but not before giving kind of cyanide pills to his 5 young children, making sure that they drift off for a forever sleep before he also commits suicide. So pretty grim ending for the Nazi high command here in the bunker of Hitler. May 2nd, 1945, Berlin falls to the Soviet army. Like I said, the Soviets do get there first. On May 5th, 1945, German forces surrender. On May 8th, 1945, war officially ends in Europe. We call this VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. So why did the Allies win? Well, the creation of the Grand Alliance was a big point for victory for the Allies. Have the United States, with its many resources that it could bring to the fight, Great Britain with its great navy and really its strong resolve to continue the fight when they seemed like they were all alone in that Battle of Britain. And of course the Soviet Union with having just the sheer numbers, more men to keep throwing at the war to continue this fight. Ultimately the three of them allying together to create this Grand Alliance creates a lot of success for this war for the Allies. Allied air power was crucial for success in Europe. To have air superiority in Europe was crucial for its success, and was really crucial for the successful D-Day landings. Once the Allies got a foothold back into Europe, the whole tone of the war changed. So 3 main reasons there of why the Allies won. The creation of the Grand Alliance, having Allied air superiority, and the successful D-Day landings. Now let's talk about Hitler's heirs. We kind of mentioned a few of kind of Hitler's heirs throughout some of these lectures. Let's talk about them again. Let's recap them. So Hitler fails to stop the escape from Dunkirk, right? The evacuation of the British soldiers from the port city of Dunkirk. British soldiers that were now able to continue fighting into this war. Hitler wanted his prize, and that was Paris. So he really wanted to take Paris. Hitler's all about breaking the will of the spirit, or breaking the spirit of the people in the major cities, hoping that they'll demand a surrender. So he doesn't really focus on the escape from Dunkirk as much as he's focused on the capture of Paris. The loss of the Battle of Britain, the first big defeat for Germany and the German Luftwaffe. Again, Hitler is looking for his prize. He wants to take the fight to London. Instead of his focusing on airfields and factories, he goes for major cities, trying to break the will of the people and hoping they demand a surrender. It doesn't go his way, and he has to retreat from Operation Sea Lion. The three-pronged attack of the Soviet Union, which he began much earlier than many of his generals believed he should have, ultimately spells disaster for the German army in the Soviet Union. The delay in sending extra forces into Normandy, not knowing that that was the D-Day, that was the day the Allies would take back Fortress Europe from Hitler. And I'm going to leave you off today with an old photo of mine that I took back in 2005. There's Mr. Mackenzie as a young man standing on the beach of Juno in the Normandy area, where there is a monument to the Allied forces. Here on the 6th of June, 1944, Europe was liberated by the heroism of the Allied forces. We're going to stop there today. Our next lecture will look at the victory in the war in the Pacific. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.